Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I am the chief economist here at American Compass. And today we have yet another wonderful episode. You're going to figure out at some point I call them all wonderful, but that's because they are. We have Aaron Renn, at this point best known for his work at aaronrenn.com. I used to work with him as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He does, I think, a lot of the most interesting work on urbanism. Also, a lot of work on the crisis of masculinity and the challenges facing men. And we have a fantastic conversation about what's going on with conservatism, what's going on with regional economics, and how conservatives can better address urban issues. So hope you stick around for that. Hope you also go check out everything we've got going on at American Compass this week. We have a piece from Aaron on urbanism and conservative governance. There was also, end of last week, a fantastic piece from Batyanger Sargon on the Democratic National Convention, tastefully titled Let Them Eat Joy, which has been tearing up the internet. So if you haven't seen that, please go check it out. We've got EPPC's Patrick Brown on the baby bonus concept. And tomorrow we will have a piece from yours truly on does trade policy affect trade, which one would think the obvious answer is yes. Some economists have come up with convoluted reasons the answer is no, but I hope you will come away concluding that yes, in fact, we can affect trade with trade policy, as one might think, and as policymakers have done consistently and with great success for centuries. Also want to be sure to remind you to check out this week's Compass Point. It's from Adam Chan, who's a national security lawyer and has worked on the House Select Committee on China. He has a really interesting proposal for tackling the problem of investment in China through tax policy, especially as long as Congress is refusing to actually bite the bullet and just prohibit investment in China. And then last but not least, I must just remind you, Understanding America, the world's best Substack, is there waiting for you to subscribe. Had what I thought was a pretty interesting piece on Monday, looking at just a lot of the mistakes that economists and economic commentators seem to be making during campaign silly season. And of course, I am back every Friday with a link roundup and everything else you should be reading. So go subscribe to that. But maybe first sit back and enjoy this podcast with Aaron Renn. And I'm joined now by Aaron Renn. Aaron, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
We go way back. I believe we literally started on the same day at the Manhattan Institute, both refugees from the consulting industry, ready
Yes.
to make our way in the world of public policy, and I think we've both managed to do so quite distinctively
Yeah.
on our respective paths.
It seemed to work out.
Well, I love reading everything you put out. If anyone listening is not already subscribing, go to aaronrenn.com. It is on. It's such thoughtful stuff on such a broad range of topics, I think, that all are informed by a wonky sensibility, but are not about policy specifics necessarily. And so I've got just a bunch of stuff I want to talk about. We'll see what we actually get to. But maybe the best place to start, and something you write about a bunch for us at American Compass, is the problem of urbanism, and particularly just in a reality where a large share, maybe even most people, depending on how you define it, live in cities or city-like areas. A conservatism that doesn't have anything to say about living in those places is probably inadequate. Where would you want to see conservatives focus? What's the right way to think about the urban world and its problems, and speak effectively to people living there?
Sure. Maybe we could talk a little bit about what it means to be urban. When we talk about the American founding and we talk about the Constitution, I think we often forget that America was essentially an almost entirely rural and agrarian society at that time. It was, pre-industrial. There were hardly any firms of any size anywhere in America until the railroads came along, starting, in the 1830s and 40s. It was just a radically different world. And in fact, that's the majority of human experience, is living in essentially rural, village, tribal environments. As recently as 1910, 90% of the world's population was rural. The United States hit 50% urban in 1920. So you had sort of the second industrial revolution, which sort of transformed the country. And then you saw this massive growth of cities on a scale that we'd really never seen before in the world. Maybe there had been a handful of cities throughout time that had as many as 1 million people in them, but something like New York City had just never existed before. Today, the Census Bureau classifies 80% of America as urban, but that's a bit of an exaggeration because essentially anything with more than 2,500 people was considered urban. So there's
So
like,
I'm coming to you from urban
yeah, yeah.
Western Massachusetts then.
So it really was a sense in which it was there, and so um, I think if we think about what's truly urban, we think of a place that's dense, mixed use, somewhat transit oriented, maybe a little bit walkable. What we think of as traditional urbanism. Um, there's probably only about 30 million people worth of that in the country. So if you add up the
Hmm.
population of New York City, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Boston, Washington D.C., Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Seattle, it's 20 million or so. But of course, those are the hearts of major regions. Certainly, major um, urban centers that include both urban and sort of their suburban hinterlands are the dominant place, you know sort of dominant geography of America in terms of where people live and where economic activity takes place. But not all cities are created equal, just as they're unequal in size, are also unequal in influence. There are certain places like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Washington in particular that have outsized influence. And so while that list of cities of 30 million people or so of that kind of dense urban area isn't necessarily the majority of the population, it has disproportionate influence because that's where the media organizations are located. That's where the federal government is located. That's where many of our top educational institutions, like Harvard, are located. Those are where the major arts organizations are located. The major foundations and NGOs are located there. The finance industry is sort of in those environments. And certainly the tech industry, although not necessarily in the city of San Francisco, is in that Bay Area. So the dominant institutions of our life, the American elite, are concentrated in these big coastal cities. And of course, in a place like Indiana, where I live today, the local elites, if you will, are disproportionately focused on downtown Indianapolis in the central city. And so these are the areas that have this power and this influence. They shape culture. And as you say, they vote overwhelmingly for the left. And I think there are some big conundrums there, just thinking about them. One is, while the Republicans should be more pro density, pro cities, you hear this sometimes, and yet population density is essentially one of the greatest predictors of whether someone's voting Democrat. It does seem like an urbanization promotes more left wing votings. But then there's also kind of the irony that conservative elites tend to like living in these big blue cities. They don't really like living in kind of hinterland Rust Belt America or rural America. And so it's interesting to think about. And there was, I think, a time, especially in the 1990s, when Republicans were seen to have something to offer cities. You think of that especially with Rudy Giuliani's New York, with the crime collapse there. Um, and again, he got some, there was a national crime decline in the 90s. It's true, but crime fell so much further in New York than
Yeah.
any other city. And it's still an outlier for being an unusually safe city today. Again, he got an assist from federal welfare reform, but there are massive declines in the welfare rolls. Cleaning up Times Square, getting rid of the squeegee men, closing down the chop shops. Uh, you know, uh, the term "the ungovernable city" in reference to New York was somewhat coined, I think, by Nathan Glazer. I don't know if he ever used that exact phrase, but Giuliani showed actually you can govern. That a place like New York isn't just destined to drift and be taken apart by interest groups. Again, Steve Goldsmith here in Indianapolis was really a pioneer in privatization. Of course, he went to the Manhattan Institute and ran state and local policy at the Manhattan Institute for a long time, and then was at Harvard Kennedy School, which he may still have an affiliation there. Was deputy mayor of New York. He's like, how can we use competition through competitive building to make cities, better, deliver better services to increase costs. So there was a time when kind of these conservative mayors were the idea people. They were getting elected. Cities were more competitive politically. Uh, Institutions like the Manhattan Institute were sort of the idea factories for urban society. And that has really, I think, changed um, in the last several years. It's become much, much more monolithically left. You've got sort of the left, and the far left. I think in these cities now,
And
and New York is probably unusual in still having a strong conservative kind of institutional presence in the city. But most cities in America today, there's essentially no conservatism, Republican Party to speak of. It's total one party
right.
rule.
And the landscape of it, but those statistics you started with are so stark because from one measure you would say, oh, 80% of America is urban. If you ask how many people actually live in these biggest cities, it's 7%, 7%. And so what that means is that the vast majority of people are actually in that sort of in between space. They're either in second tier cities, they're in urban areas, meaning more the almost sort of suburban surrounding bedroom communities of folks who might live in the city or be economically connected to the city, but don't in the same way experience the kind of residential problems of a city.
Yeah, so
And
most people are
so
living in suburbs today. I mean, suburbs are really, you know, increasingly where people live. And of course, suburban areas are a form of urbanization, uh, but they are somewhat distinct, I think, from the core city. So when we talk about urban, we have to talk about what kind of urban are we talking about?
right, because I just think if I were to say, okay, you know, significant share, even most America is urban. What are the big problems for urban America? It is crime, it is public transportation, it is quality of public schools, etc. But that's really a description of the things in actual sort of center cities in a sense. That I don't think it would be the right case to say the vast majority of people in suburban areas would have those kinds of issues at the top of their list. Is that fair, or do those apply to the suburban areas as well at this point?
Well, there's certainly been an increase in housing prices, across the country, even in a sort of tertiary city like here in Indianapolis. In the Indianapolis region, the price to income ratio of housing here used to be 2.7. So the average house costs 2.7 times the average income. That's very affordable. Well, today it's 4.0. So we're starting to get more expensive. But certainly the problems in a Flint, Michigan, the problems in a Wheeling, West Virginia, a St. Louis, they're just very different from the problems of Washington, D.C., or New York City, or a lot of places. Um, and certainly that sky high rents that you found in New York. It's no surprise to me that like New York and San Francisco is where this YIMBY movement that wants to kind of a more radical libertarian approach to development got started. So a lot of the times the problems of the cities are disproportionate. And someone quipped. It may have been Matthew Iglesias. He made this quip about LaGuardia. That like it's amazing the extent to which how the third busiest airport in New York defines what people think of as America's third world airports. Because the media class all flies through LaGuardia. I've flown through LaGuardia, old LaGuardia Central Terminal, so horrible. You're like, we have a third world country when it comes to airports, but that's like one airport in New York, that was so bad. Of course, they've redone it; it's very nice today. But the kind of the parochial issues of some of these cities do become quote unquote the issues because that's where the media class lives. Whereas I think some of the issues in um, the rest of America are different. I mean, there are a lot of places that are struggling because nobody wants to move there. Declining populations, aging populations, uh, serious pension issues, inability to maintain basic public services, economies propped up by public transfers. Cities, we've seen this in so many domains of society where we've become sort of a bifurcated society in which there are winners and there are losers. And so what we see is there's like a couple classes of places that are big winners from a sort of elite uh, per capita income, per capita GDP perspective, like those big coastal cities I mentioned. Then there's some places in the Sun Belt that are big winners because they're growing their number of their people, their jobs, they're expanding horizontally, if you will. Dallas, Nashville, places like that. Then you get a lot of places that are sort of left behind, overlooked. And then there's some places like Indianapolis that are doing okay. And it's like, well, what it's kind of like more a question of which pile are they going to end up in, the winner pile or the loser pile. And of
Hmm.
course, we see this income inequality, that, yeah, great. If you're in the top 20, 25% of America, things are awesome. If you're in that traditional middle class and you're not one of the people who's moved up in the rankings to the upper middle class, you are getting the squeeze put on you. Same thing, sort of with individuals, right? The people who get into the good colleges, their life is great. So, other people are struggling. So I do think we've had a kind of a bifurcated economy where we have like sort of things happening in one set of places, very successful, have what you might call the problems of success. Uh, yeah, but other places have very different sets of problems.
Yeah, and that's a trend that we see in so many domains, right? As you said, you see it with individuals, you see it with regions, you see it with firms, right? One of the real trends, I mean, you look at the stock market and the amount of stock market gain being driven by literally a handful of companies. There's increasing research showing that inequality and gaps in productivity are really driven by firm level differences where if you're working in the right industry or in the right firm, things are great. Otherwise, they're not. We had this period, decades of what the economists called convergence, where the poorer a region was, the faster it was catching up. And sometime around mid 1980s, this flipped, and all of a sudden, not only were you not catching up, you were potentially falling further behind. Um, I want to talk about, so what does that mean for the areas that are falling behind? But first, I want to ask one other question because I was at an event recently where that was focused on the housing crisis, and of course the speakers coming from these urban areas were defining the housing crisis as how hard it is for a newly minted college graduate to afford a brownstone apartment in one of these three cities. And it, one reaction is to say like, well, this is just not representative. Like this is a very niche issue. But it seems to me it speaks even further to this divergence or bifurcation in the sense that isn't the answer to say, well, then that's not where you should live. The very fact that all of the newly minted college graduates are going to these four places or want to or think they should is part of what drives the bifurcation. Isn't there a sort of killing two birds with one stone of saying, actually, these insanely high rents and unaffordability are just a very useful signal telling you this is unsustainable and impractical, and let us tell you about all the other places in the country you could go live and help grow.
Yeah, well, like a lot of these things are related. So if you're a young, ambitious person, um, you want to be where the highest opportunities are. And the highest opportunities in the economy are in San Francisco and New York and in DC and in these places like that. So you want to work in the finance industry, you want to work in tech. Economists talk about agglomerations of talent driving economic growth. That you're more productive when you're around other talented people doing the same thing, and sort of the clustering, particularly in the knowledge industries. And that's what's different, I think, about today's economy versus, so to say, the industrial economy. The Midwest industrial economy kind of benefited from agglomerations too. You had a region where it had iron ore, and it had steel mills, and it had rail lines, and it had labor, and it had factories. And it was this cluster, if you will, and the thing that enabled it to build all these things. But it was more spread out. You would have a factory in a Muncie, Indiana, or a Marion, Indiana, or a Youngstown, Ohio. It wasn't just in the Chicago Loop in downtown Detroit, although those might have been the nerve centers that controlled everything. So it's, you went to law school. So people say, well, should I go to law school? And I would say if you can't get into one of the top 10 law schools or top 14, whatever that top tier law schools, don't go to law school because you're going to end up with a lot of debt and you're not going to be able to get into the high. So there's like fewer and fewer places where there's more, where there's the opportunity is clustered, just like there's fewer college, the top colleges are harder to get into. They're more competitive. And that's sort of become the nature, a little bit of the nature of the economy. And not only that, these are great places to live. They have tons of amenities. It's not just the economy. There is no place else in the world like New York City. It's an amazing place to live. If you want public transit and that. And if you move to Indianapolis, you're moving to middle America, and there's no doubt about that. And so you've got sort of a middle of the road, don't want to be too far ahead of anything else, kind of want to be average. It's not a place for super high ambitions, for example. And so I think there is sort of all of these things are basically related. And it's not just about um, here, it's happening in other countries too. It's happening in the UK. I mean, the UK, I think we should look at the UK and say, this is a warning of what happens to your society if you take the trends that have been having in America and extrapolate them too far out. They've basically got one city, London, whose finance industry and some of its knowledge industries are doing quite well. But the rest of the UK, what is it really needed for? There's no mining anymore. There's not the factories in Manchester anymore. It's not going to be a great transportation hub for the most part. You're probably not going to set up new manufacturing there. It's an island. You got to get everything in and out of it. And so essentially, it's like, what does the world want from the UK? It wants these select knowledge industries and London real estate. And at the same time, prices everywhere have gone through the roof in terms of real estate because they don't let them build anything, and their public services are degrading. And there's like tons and tons of studies talking about the impoverishment of the British people. And when you get to a place where your economy only does one or two things that anybody wants, it creates a very unhealthy environment. Now, we're much better because we're a continental scale nation. We have vast natural resources to develop. We have a vast agricultural industry that produces a lot of value. We have huge transportation, distribute. There's a lot that we can do. And we do have a lot of manufacturing. And there are a lot of things you might want to manufacture here. But, a country of 330 million people can't be operated as a knowledge economy boutique. It's just not, if you're the Nordics, you can do a lot of things that you can't do when you're America. Even if you're Switzerland, yeah, we can have some super high tech manufacturing of watches and pharmaceuticals and other little things that they have. Great high tech manufacturing, but it's a limited scale country, and you can do a lot there. When you're in even the UK with 50, 60 million people, you can't really do that, and it's the same problem here as well. So I think those are things we ought to be concerned about, as a nation.
Right. Well, and it seems like because it's an interesting case study in my mind for the kind of the limits of the conventional economic analyses that will take something like agglomeration and assume, well, if agglomeration is good, more agglomeration is even better. And how do we turn the dial up to 11 essentially? I should go back and figure out who wrote this paper because I talk about it all the time. There was this paper sort of showing here's how much more GDP growth we could get if basically everybody could move to New York and San Francisco.
Yeah, that might have been Enrico Moretti. Shea and Moretti may have written that one. Yeah. He's done great work on divergence, right? All the stuff on the new geography of jobs and these places that had similar college degree attainment, like Albuquerque and Seattle. Back in the 70s, Bill Gates moves back to Seattle from Albuquerque, and now the massive divergence between them.
Yeah, and that's actually the new geography of jobs, which is Marty's book, is excellent, I think. But a paper like this speaks to a sort of shortcoming in a model of economics that doesn't take into account those factors of national prosperity and human nature, for that matter, that can't just kind of be pushed to the limit in the model. It seems to me we are at the point where, in fact, you could make a case that the benefits of at the margin of diffusion would be greater than the benefits of agglomeration. That is, that all things equal, we should be very excited to see efforts to spread investment more widely, to see tech companies leaving Silicon Valley to set up shop elsewhere. just to see less concentration of talent in just the top universities and more of a scattering across, the public universities in every state. Um, is that right, or is that just a nice aspirational thing to think? And in fact, the less if we move if we don't lean into agglomeration, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't think we want to try to artificially limit agglomerations. A lot of countries that are hyper centralized, like France, like England, have thought about, well, why don't we move BBC studios over here? We'll move
Right.
agencies over there. Why don't we move the Department of Agriculture to Kansas City or something like that? You hear ones like that. I don't know how feasible um, that really is, given the nature of um, some of these technologies that are out there. So you take something like biotech there. You really, it requires very specialized skills, and there just aren't that many people with kind of postdocs in biotech, and the place that produces the most of them is the Boston area, and so it makes a lot of sense for that industry to be concentrated in Boston in a lot of areas. Where I think one reason, here's where I think about agglomerations, and again, I haven't. This is a little quasi speculative, but there is a counterfactual here. I think because some of this agglomeration is enabled through government action, and that in essence, New York City is a city, for example, that yes, I can tell the story of New York like I just did, but New York City only exists because it's been repeatedly bailed out by the federal government. It was bailed out in the 1970s, and it was bailed out in 2007, 2008. And, we had this financial crisis. Lehman Brothers blew up, and the federal government decided we're going to make sure every other financial institution in New York City survives. If we had let all the banks go under in the financial crash, what would New York City be today? If you think about that. And you can even think about the same thing happen on a little bit of a scale in Silicon Valley, and not the totally scale, but like with Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank, all of those firms that had their money there far in excess of the insurance limits were made 100% whole through that. Now, of course, did the actual homeowners who were getting foreclosed on in the financial crash get bailed out? No. So we've chosen repeatedly to take government action that has underwritten the development of these cities, especially finance in New York. And everybody likes to say, "Oh, people made a profit with TARP," but the point of a managing, through a business is like, if you run out of money, if you run out of capital, then you're bankrupt, and you have to go through a restructuring process. And yes, if there's value in the business, then there's a restructuring. But essentially, this idea that like, oh yeah, we'll just give you unlimited capital so that you never face any sort of capital crisis, and then maybe even eventually we'll make a profit on it. The idea that that's not market distorting is ridiculous because no other industry has the backstop that the finance industry has, where they can take on unlimited risk, essentially. And if anything goes wrong, the federal government bails them out, makes them whole, organizes things. Now, again, maybe it would be bad for America if our finance industry collapsed, but we can't suggest that somehow New York City's success is not at least in part an artifact of federal government action
Yeah.
to bail
Well,
it out.
I'll be speculative for a minute as well, because this is, one of my favorite policy ideas I've never really developed, but we'll throw it out there. You can tell me what you think. Is, it seems to me there's a way in which you could tell the exact same story about biotech in Boston. The reason biotech is in Boston is because Harvard and MIT are in Boston, and billions of dollars of federal funding flow to those two universities in particular to do lots of biotech research. You look at the list of top recipients of federal research funding. It is a sort of specific set of research universities, for the most part concentrated in particular places. Um, why not spread that out? Why not, in fact, say it is, in fact, a public priority of ours to distribute our research money to the top labs at the public universities in all 50 states? And if you're a top researcher who wants to be doing federally funded research, go run a lab at one of those places.
Well, there is a sense in which that's true. I do think I look at it this way: if we're going to be funding research into curing diseases, we should be funding it based on what's most effective. It should not be seen as a way to do economic development. But it is true that we've been doing industrial policy all along. Industrial policy is well known. The federal government created Silicon Valley. I think it's Steve Blank who has a great presentation on the secret history of Silicon Valley. It all came out of government contracts.
Right. If I could recommend the American Compass state case study, Silicon Valley's public
Yeah,
garages, we run right through it's fascinating. Even like the fact that chips are on silicon is because the Air Force said we don't want germanium, we want silicon.
right.
And
Eh,
off they went.
Yeah.
Could have been Germanium Valley.
Or just look at where the space industry is located. The space industry is where it is because during the Apollo program and things, it's like what congressman's districts had the right thing. So it's like Purdue University here in Indiana has one of the top aerospace engineering programs in the entire country. There is essentially no aerospace industry in Indiana. We got a few engine manufacturers. Rolls Royce does engines here and things like that. But like we don't have like part of the space program here. Well, why not? Well, maybe we didn't have the right congressman there, and Huntsville, Alabama did, and Houston, Texas did. And then people make these decisions and then they have knock-on consequences forever. And then people talk about, oh, well, the talent is here. So of course, but the talent is there because you made the investment in the first place. So many of these places are definitely a product of government action, no doubt. And of course, Washington, D.C. itself only exists, because we decided to put the capital there, for example. So there is a sense in which these places don't want to acknowledge the extent to which they exist because of federal government action. These are not places that just ended up where they are through essentially, an accident of history, for example. And I'm
Right.
not saying I'm not saying everything was a product of government action, but certainly was. Our land grant university system itself was a product of government action, and that was one that was spread out around the country. So I do think that the idea of trying to have broad-based prosperity is important. But I think when you get into like, let's allocate our NIH research dollars based on geographic quotas, that's probably not good for research because it's like the proverbial 10x programmer, right? Some people are just vastly vastly better than others at doing certain things. And when you have that talent, we want our government to be effectively spent. It's like people who say, well, building this road will be economic development. Think about all the jobs this construction project will make when the amount of jobs you're creating is a measure of the cost of what you're doing, not the benefits. And so I think we want to be very careful in how we do it, but it's not wrong to suggest that, yeah, these people are Harvard and MIT and some of these schools probably favored by the government even today, probably because the people running the government went to those schools, right? The people who are making the decisions went to those schools. So, of course, there's probably extra credit for them and everything. It's not even like conscious. It's like, of course, Harvard and Yale and Stanford and these places, get these benefits. There's some crazy stat. Somebody did an analysis of where top venture capitalists went to school, and like overwhelmingly they went to one of two places, Harvard or Stanford. So naturally that's going to bias the way they think about, which places do you fund, what people do you fund. Well, I'm probably going to fund people from Stanford because I'm a Stanford guy. So there's probably some subconscious things going in there.
Right. Yeah, I think the one thing I'll say about the kind of research funding piece, to your point about the 10x programmer, is I think something nice about university research, at least for this purpose, is that you do have an exceptionally mobile workforce and a culture that expects the top talent to essentially follow the federal funds. That is, it would make no sense to say, well, we want to have a great research program at Purdue, therefore whoever the top researchers at Purdue happen to be are automatically the ones who get the funding. But if you have the top researchers essentially going to where the funding is, you have significant control over that. To your point, there is still the value of agglomeration, and you wouldn't want to scatter them to the wind. I want to just pick up one really interesting analogy in what you were saying about sort of, there's no particular reason these things are in these places necessarily. It's interesting just to see that same thing in the international context, where the sort of economic theory of comparative advantage is supposed to tell us that, these things all get made where people naturally have this advantage to make them efficiently. And that made sense in a world of natural resources and agriculture. And as you were saying earlier, in the US, the initial hubs of industrial activity were centered around places where there were particular agricultural or resources or natural resources that made them the places you wanted to build. But just as there's no particular reason that Taiwan is the best place to make semiconductors, that is a function of government policy. Likewise, a lot of the things that are the top industries in a modern economy, whether industrial or knowledge driven, are going to be ones that that essentially are either a product of luck or of policy choices, not anything inherent to the particular spot.
Yeah, and the other thing about comparative advantages, it assumes there's again a lot of this was developed. Didn't Ricardo come up with the comparative advantage in the 1700s, or maybe it was
Yes, early
your
1800s.
early
Yeah,
1800s? And things were getting big. England had industrialized, but you're somewhat you're not really talking about a fully industrialized society yet either. And sort of the part of the assumption is that there's a firm, in Portugal making wine, and there's a firm in England making cloth, and you're exporting, you're trading. But what you have today is supply chains that are driven by global corporations. So it wasn't like this country decided to start a company that was going to create this thing and trade with you. It's the multinational decided to establish an operation there
right.
because it had the cheapest labor or something of that nature. And that doesn't necessarily invalidate the theory, but it is a sense. I mean, I worked in the IT outsourcing industry, and so one of the jobs that I had, and one of the reasons I don't do that anymore, it wasn't very fun, is let's move jobs from a low cost country to an even lower cost country. It's like, let's just move these things around in terms of the cheapest place we can get it done. And so that's definitely part of it. And it's again global firms who are optimizing their supply chains. It's not countries or firms doing these sort of trade deals, if you will. Still a little bit different there. And
Yeah.
again, the theory, I mean, it's just a lot of little things about the textbook theory that people don't really talk about, which is sort of presumes capital immobility. It sort of presumes kind of labor immobility to some extent. So we just live it, not saying that the theory is invalid or anything of that nature per se, but it's just much, much more complex than people, give it give it credit for today.
Yes. Yeah. So, all right. So let's talk about one more thing then, which is how do we help left behind areas? If whether you're thinking about a place like Indianapolis that you were sort of saying could go either way, or places that have basically already gone the wrong way, and maybe the answer is different in these two categories. What, if anything, in terms of national policy, actually would help them, and then what can they themselves be doing to help themselves?
Right. So one of the things I look at is there are a lot of things are driven at the local level. They're just driven by macro factors outside your control. So I wrote this article about Indiana for American Affairs magazine. One of the things I point out is this 23 state region that I call the Old North, which includes the Great Plains, the Midwest, and the Northeast, plus some kind of, you might think of it as border states like Kentucky. None of those places are doing especially well. They're weak demographically. They don't have great population growth. Most of them aren't even really attracting immigrants. We have something like 45 million foreign-born people in the country, and we still haven't repopulated Detroit. So, how many immigrants would you have to bring into America in order to repopulate Detroit at current rates? Immigrants are going where the jobs are being created, which some of them go to these places, but they don't by and large, are going to the Sun Belt boomtowns and other places where jobs are being created. So there isn't great population or job growth in these places, any of them. Um, the only one in the 2010s that did even really better than the national average was North Dakota, which had a fracking boom.
Right.
And I don't even know if how well North Dakota is doing these days. And you know, that's where like you look at Minnesota, which has been in the news because of their governor. Minnesota on paper looks like it has everything. Highly educated workforce, lots of college educated people, and big Fortune 500 headquarters and universities and the Mayo Clinic and all that stuff. But like Minnesota's pretty anemic, and everything that was you would say was better in Minnesota was better in the 1970s. You compare Minneapolis, St.
Mhm.
Paul to Seattle over the past 40 years. I mean, my goodness, right? I mean, a place like Denver, Phoenix wouldn't have even been considered in the same league as Minneapolis, St. Paul in 1980. So it's an underperformer. And so for whatever reason, people just don't want to move to places that have winter. And that's
I
the
was about to say how much of we were just saying it's all luck, but actually how much of this sounds to me like you just defined
yeah.
the places where it snows and the places where it doesn't snow.
Yeah. So it's and that's the reality. And so some of these places, it's like New Hampshire's the live free or die state with no income or sales tax. Vermont is the socialist utopia. They're not that different statistically. Indiana and Illinois, one is as red as you get, one is as blue as you get. Yes, the Indiana people talk about our growth is a little higher. The Illinois people say their incomes are a little better. Neither of them are that great. So you could look at urban, rural, you could look at, large states, small states. There are so many things. And so the reality is maybe there isn't a great policy solution that's going to reflate any of these places unless the market changes. So my theory has been let's try to make life as good as we can for the people who live in these places. And so we have to, and this is one where I think conservatives have often been extremely hesitant to act. We have to work to elevate our people, to invest in our people, which is something that we used to do in the past through something like the high school movement, right? It said, oh, we need to have, better education. We need to have better sanitation in our cities. We need to have better public health measures. Many things that were designed to improve the lives of our people. Maybe we should, pasteurize milk, and stuff like that. Well,
Oh,
that's some
big
big government.
government milk pasteurization.
Yeah,
Come
yeah. Well, of
on.
course, we'll all hear how it was one guy that convinced everybody, and it was the government and all that. But the
They were just trying to keep the small guys out.
right,
It was just industry
right,
capture.
right. So, but the point is, like, the reality is, we have a lot of people who are struggling today. They grew up in single parent households, which we know is terrible. We have all these drugs today that can blow up people's lives. So I think education, is foundational to that. We have to do a better job on education. I think the idea that the public schools don't work uh, it was empirically shown to be false during the pandemic because when we shut the schools down, people actually fell behind. So we know the schools are doing something, as bad as they may be. So we can't give up on schooling. I think we should try to make we have to help our people build a life as best they can in this, and that's hard. And I think the conservative critique is right. It's very, very hard to do that, but we can't give up on that. I think a second one is to um, basically improve the quality of place. Can we have like good playgrounds? Can we have good basic public services? Can we have a decent library? Can we have sidewalks right in our city? Can we fix up our historic buildings? Things that improve the quality of the place for the people who live there. And if that attracts other people, that's great. And then lastly, I think we do have to address the cultural aspirations and preferences of the people who live in these places. And you know, basically our elites have basically said we're going to cram elite preference down everyone's throat, uh, no matter what they think. We are going to have a de facto open borders immigration policy. We're not going to enforce the border. We're not going to have mandatory e-verify. We're not going to deport anybody, including many of them after they commit serious crimes. Um, we're simply not going to do anything on that. And I'm like, even if you think immigration isn't that good, why are people so militant that like a large scale, essentially indiscriminate immigration should just be allowed to the country? Like that's one that like is so unpopular with people. Why can't we just dial that back a little bit? And so I think there are a lot of things like that. I think in red states, yeah, you probably should have constitutional carry on guns. Maybe in blue states, blue cities, you should have more progressive policies because that's what the people want. You can't just ignore the cultural preferences of the people uh, too much, or you end up you end up producing like massive resentment. I mean, again, if you think Donald Trump is really the worst thing that's happened to America like ever, which some people seem to do, then the fact that you were unwilling to curtail immigration at all, enforce immigration at all, means you were responsible for him being here. Because if not for immigration, he would never have been elected president. And so it's like we, the elites, get to make whatever decisions we want, to cram our preferences down other people's throat. And if they dare do anything about that, they're the problem. And so I think those are the three issues. Invest in our people, help them to build a life, to help improve the quality of places and public services and communities, and then respond at some level to the cultural aspirations of the people. It doesn't mean you have to give them everything they want, but you got to give them at least something.
That makes sense. I have so many more things I wanted to talk about,
By the way,
but we are out of
I don't
time.
think that will necessarily reflate anything either. That's
Right.
not going to bring them back, but maybe it'll help the people who live there, and so um, that's kind of how I think about it for some of these places in the
Yeah.
Midwest where it doesn't look like the market demand is there.
Well, and it's helpful in defining the goal. The goal is not to reflate particular places. Shifts in, geographic shifts in the population have always occurred and presumably always will occur, and can be greatly welfare enhancing for everybody who chooses to stay and who chooses to move. Um, the goal is, in fact, for people to have good lives wherever it is they are living, and I think that's very clarifying. Um, I could I have gotten to a few of the things on my list, but so be it. We'll have to do it
Right.
again. Aaron Renn of aaronrenn.com. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we will be back again next week with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.